Alrighty. Let's go ahead and get started. So I have some bad news. There have been some developments that have happened in the last hour or so, and I will not be able to do a review session Friday morning before the exam. Okay? I'm sorry. However, to make up for that, you can take a 3.5 by 5 note card, and anything that you can fit on that 3.5 by 5 note card and read without the use of something extreme, you can bring that, since I cannot do a review session. So I'm sorry, but you're welcome. Yeah. Front and back. Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, you'll find out. I have done this many a time, and I mean, don't think that that's all you need, because that is not all you need. So you need to prepare for this exam in the same way. I would say that it's probably equally helpful to having a review session, which is why, since I can't do a review session, I will offer that to you. But it is not going to save you if you do not prepare for the exam. All right? So prepare for the exam well, as if you couldn't use that note card. Because I don't know, maybe on Friday I'll show up and I'll say, just kidding, you can't use the note card. I would never do that. Actually, I can't say I would never do that, but I probably won't do that. Pretty good probability that I will not do that, because who knows? I mean, maybe the Dodgers lose 2 more games before Friday, and I just come really depressed and angry, and then I don't know what might happen. Actually, I don't care at this point. All right, let me pray for us. We'll get a little bit more serious, and we'll finish up our discussion of seedless plants. Let's pray. Father, I'm humbled every time I'm reminded that you are not just allowing me, but encouraging me to participate with you in what you're doing. And Father, I thank you for that, and I thank you that you've made that same offer available to these students as well. And Father, I pray that with your Spirit you would equip us during this time and during every opportunity we have to grow academically, spiritually, that we might be better stewards of what you've given, and we might be able to serve you better and work better with you as you work on redeeming all of your creation. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. So we left off sort of here. We actually left off, I drew you the geological time scale and separated it into 3 main eras, really a fourth if you take Precambrian as being a 4th era, and then separated the Paleozoic era into 6 periods, right? Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, right? You remember leaving off there and you loved it and you're like, man, I've heard some of these terms before and now I know a little bit more about what it means and I love it, right? I'm going to start describing everything in terms of this geological time scale. So instead of saying yesterday or last week, I'll say in the latter point of the Cenozoic period or Cenozoic era, right? No? Okay. I don't do. Could I do that for the rest of the semester? No, that would be really hard. That's really hard. It's like trying to maintain talking in the third person and not ever ruin it. It's tough.
That would be cool.
It would be cool. The easiest way to do it, actually, if you really want to do it, just after everything you say, said Joseph, right? And then that way you don't actually need to do anything abnormal except for just end your statement in different. Or you could say exclaimed Joseph. Question, yeah. All right. Yeah, I told you we were going to get more serious, and we're not. Yeah, sorry. All right. So this is the 4th framing question where I wanted to get on Monday, and we didn't quite get there, but that's all right. So how do the Bryophytes compare? Keep in mind that the Bryophytes, we are referring to non-vascular seedless plants. So not only are they seedless, but they also don't have a vascular system, meaning they don't have a great way of storing and transporting water, which is why they don't have roots, which is why they can grow where there's no soil, like right on the surface of a rock or on your rooftop. And so you probably have an indication that bryophytes are referring to mosses and some others. So bryophytes are divided into 3 phyla, and we do this based on some of their characteristics, although this grouping is also supported by genetic information. So they look different, they are different genetically, and so first phylum, Hepatocophyta.
Okay, I found this on the web for our different genetically insel first phylum.
Thank you, Siri. She did nothing for me there, which I don't even know what she was doing. Hepatocophyta are liverworts. So these are believed or thought to be the most closely related to green algae. The group that is supposed to share ancestry with land plants. There's some reasons for that. One, they're genetically most similar, which is convenient. They also lack cuticles, that waxy cuticle, one of those structures we said land plants have to prevent water loss or fight desiccation, which is interesting because here's a land plant that doesn't actually have it. And this is believed to be the closest relative, so this should represent that original land plant best, and that original land plant then wouldn't have it. So then could you use it as a characteristic of all land plants? No, but we do, right? And so it's kind of an interesting thing. Sexes are separate, and the Sporophyte, that is the portion that produces spores, is actually located inside of the female Gametophyte, the Archegonium. So the Archegonium is your female Gametophyte. Antheridium is the male Gametophyte. You'll see those terms in a little bit again, so don't worry about getting them down. But yeah, the Sporophyte is actually contained within the female Gametophyte, completely protected. Asexual reproduction is possible in this group, which is interesting for a land plant. And so there are cups on a lot of these liverworts, and inside they'll produce structures called gymi. And those gymi, if they leave that cup, if they are pushed out or blown out from the wind, they can actually develop into a whole new gametophyte, a whole new liverwort, which is fun. I mean, there are animals that do that. There aren't a lot of plants that do that. So it's in many ways unique, although there are a lot of algae that do that as well. Anthocerato or Ceratophyta. Anthocerato are hornworts. So they're called hornworts because it looks like they have a horn. Still, the gametophyte is the dominant stage, but the sporophyte is pipe-like and extends out of the gametophyte. And it's there throughout the life of the gametophyte. It doesn't just develop at certain times, it's there always, and it looks like a horn coming off of the plant, which is why we call them hornworms. These have stomata, which are openings. They have a waxy cuticle, so water has a very hard time crossing that, but there are places where you actually need to have some water loss, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about why that is sometime this semester, maybe not. But they have stomata that can open up and allow water to leave and allow carbon dioxide to get inside of the plant. So you find these on the sporophyte, that pipe-like structure. Then they have another unique structure, pseudo-elaters, that are inside of the gametophyte that actually shoot the spores out of the gametophyte. So sporophytes inside of the gametophyte, like it is in liverworts, although it's there all the time and it looks like a horn. And the sporophyte produces spores. The gametophyte produces what? Gametes, okay? And so the spores that are being produced, they are kicked out or shot out with these pseudo-elaters so that the developing gametophyte that's going to come from that spore doesn't compete directly with its parent. It's actually a really neat way of spreading the wealth, right? Moving your children over to other areas, and so you don't compete directly with them for resources. And then the last phylum, Bryophyta, which is interesting that we use this to represent all of the organisms in this group, but this is the true Bryophyta, are mosses. So they are cosmopolitan, meaning you find them all over the world. They are the main plant in tundra, which is some of the driest, definitely one of the coldest biomes on Earth. You find them in a lot of tropical areas, just an incredible variety. A lot of different kinds of mosses. There are people that spend their whole lives studying mosses and are never satisfied. Never get to the end of the amount of variety inside there. I don't know anybody that has spent their life studying mosses, but those people do exist. So they have flagellated sperm that can swim, and so they are still restricted to somewhat damp environments. They have stomata for allowing water to leave and carbon dioxide to enter. They have a primitive vascular system, sort of. And then they have rhizoids. And rhizoids are believed to be what roots develop from. And this is a structure that just helps to hold the mosses, say, onto a tree trunk or onto a rock or onto a rooftop, but don't actually get down into anything. And that's why, again, you don't need soil for these bryophytes, because they don't have a true vascular system. Yeah, I don't know how much opportunity we'll have to talk about this primitive vascular system that bryophytes have, but it is nothing like the vascular system you find in vascular plants, okay? So when we call it primitive, the idea there is that this may have given rise to the vascular system that you find in vascular plants, but it is really nothing like it. It does store water. It can transport it in very limited ways, but it's not in any way developed the same. All right, so now we need to look at some examples of these. So you can see them. You can't love something you've never seen, right? Well, I guess you could, but it's hard. Okay, so let's put some faces to these names. Here's a liverwort. I mean, it's beautiful, right? Liverwort. Dominant phase or dominant portion of the life cycle is the gametophyte, meaning you're looking at the gametophyte. Okay, sporophyte's going to be a very small structure producing what? What does the sporophyte produce? Spores. What does the gametophyte produce? Look at that. You already know everything. Why am I even here? I don't know, but I am. But for fun. I'm having fun, absolutely. So here's the life cycle of a typical liverwort. Here's a representation of your gametophyte. Here's archegonia. These are your female producing structures. Your antheridium, where are we here? Antheridium, your male producing structures. Here's the dominant portion of the life cycle, and then here's showing you how you actually produce the sporophyte. So here's the archegonium, again, the female structure, the female gametophyte. Here's the fertilization that's taken place. Female gametophyte produces gametes, but she produces female gametes, right? Because she's a female gametophyte. Make sense? Male gametophyte produces male gametes, sperm, and so the sperm fuses with the egg to form your embryo. Your embryo develops into your sporophyte. And here's your sporophyte containing spores, because sporophytes produce what? Spores. That's wonderful. And so here's your liverwort. Again, the sporophyte's going to be a very small structure contained on the gametophyte. Sexes tend to be separate. So you have male liverworts, female liverworts, without a lot of difference in structure except for in the size of the gametes they're producing. Yeah?
Do they grow from like the same structure, or are they separate structures?
They're separate plants altogether. Yep, separate plants altogether. Now, not all plants do that. A lot of plants have produce both male and female gametes in the same plant. In fact, that's probably the norm for plants. But there are several species that do have separate sexes. Yeah. All right, so hornworts. Here are these horns that I was telling you about. These are the sporophytes. Okay, they're present throughout the life of the gametophyte. This one, sexes are not separate. A single individual produces both male and female gametes. And so a single individual has both, or has a spore-producing structure that's going to produce a single type of spore. So here are just the only thing I want to illustrate here. One, again, actually there are two things. One, again, the gametophyte is the dominant stage. And so the sporophyte is a structure on this. And here's this illustrating coming off of your gametophyte. And then here's your pseudo-elater ejecting those spores. Okay, so as those spores, which are going to develop into new gametophytes, get released, they get shot out of these hornworts. To try to spread it around so that, again, the offspring do not compete directly with the parents for resources. Fantastic. Okay. Yeah. Anyways, we'll get there when we talk about seed plants, but a lot of seed plants do this as well. And then finally, the life cycle of a moss. And so this actually is a pretty neat diagram, I think, because it demonstrates to you basically the movement through these various structures. So here's your sporophyte. Your sporophyte is contained on the gametophyte. You see your gametophyte is here, and your sporophyte is contained on that. Okay? Sporophyte's producing spores, and then those spores can develop into new gametophytes, showing you how that actually works. And then your gametophytes produce gametes, and those gametes, when they fuse, form a sporophyte that produces spores. And why do plants do this? Alternate generations between gametophyte, sporophyte. I don't know. They're not necessarily any better equipped to survive than eukaryotes that don't, but it is a very unique type of life cycle, and it is something that all plants have. And it is something that some algae have, but not the algae that plants are supposed to be most closely related to. So green algae do not have this alternation of generations like plants do. Brown algae do. And so you have kind of this really unique, very complex life history involving cycling between two different existences, one that has one copy of the genome, one that has two, and now you have it in two different groups that don't share an ancestor that would have had it. And so it'd be another example of convergence, and a very complicated one. How does it evolve? I don't know. Why does it evolve? Does it provide any particular advantage? Not really. It's just a different strategy. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is just like, how does the evolutionist, like, what would be the evolutionist explanation
Of why this exists?
And like the variety within like the alternation of generation?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Now, one thing you need to know is something does not need to be advantageous in order for it to be a reality, right? So organisms can do something that isn't necessarily advantageous, because natural selection isn't the only way to actually produce something, okay? And so even if your view of origins does not hold to a creator that created things to function in a particular way, there are other ways in which you can explain the presence of something that's not advantageous, okay? And there's some ways you can do that. We'll get into those discussions at the end of our semester. We'll talk about the mechanics of evolution, how it works, and how you can get something that isn't necessarily advantageous. Yeah. Yeah.
So the reproduction of these organisms, is it technically internal fertilization, or is this considered external?
Oh yeah, no, it is internal fertilization for sure. Yep. The egg is always kept inside that archegonium, the female gametophyte, and the egg is held in there, and fertilization takes place internally.
So that's the definition.
Yeah, so sperm has to get inside the archegonium, and the sperm tend to swim, and that's why these tend to be restricted to moist environments, where there's enough water that the sperm can swim to the archegonium. Now, if male and female parts are on the same plant, it's not nearly as complicated. A droplet of water alone provides enough water for that movement. But if sexes are separate, like they are in liverworts, it's a bit more challenging. Except for if you go to a place where you find liverworts, I mean, they're growing right on top of each other. Basically like a solid mat of separate individuals. Whew. All right, any questions? Now we finally got to my goal to get to on Monday, and it is like 20 minutes into our class on Wednesday. But we did it, okay? And so we've got 2 more framing questions, and we're almost ready for our lecture break. So if you're longing for that, it's coming soon. Okay. So why are vascular plants larger than non-vascular plants? Surprise, vascular plants are larger than non-vascular plants. And now we need to talk about why. So we can group all vascular plants together in a group that we call Tracheophyta. Tracheophytes. They're named after the presence of the water conducting and transporting cells. But this contains more than 260,000 species of plants, way more than are contained in the Bryophytes. And we'll get to that. So they have roots, and they have reinforced conducting cells, these tracheids, these cells that are really well designed for storing and transporting water. It's really interesting. They are arguably dead cells, similar to the cells that form our skin and our hair, and basically serve a single function. But instead of protection, like our skin and our hair, their function is storing and transporting water. You're like, how does something dead transport water? It's a wonderful question. We'll get there. Well, it's like, how does a pipe transport water? It's not living either, right? And the thing is water transports itself. We'll get there right now. Surprise. Water transports itself. You just have to get out of the way and let that happen. Okay? Water sticks to itself, right? And so if you can kind of have one place where there's not a lot of water, water's going to want to get there, right? And so if you get out of the way and let it happen, water will get there. And that's basically how these cells function. So this vascular system, the roots and these conducting cells are what allow for the large size. And so you form basically a vascular system that's composed of one part, the xylem. Xylem stores and transports water and nutrients throughout the plant. And what do you imagine the dominant cell type in the xylem is? Look at that. Why do you even need me? Why am I here? I'm having a good time. That's why I'm here, right? So these cells are reinforced with lignin. And lignin itself is impermeable to water, meaning water can't leave in certain directions and can only move in one direction. Again, it's like water's going to move itself. You just kind of help to focus that a little bit, you know? Yeah. Roots also provide a strong anchor, and so if a plant's going to get really big, you need some way to anchor it because gravity is going to be pulling it down, right? And so the roots do a good job of anchoring it and also do a really good job of penetrating deep down into the soil in search of water. And then we'll introduce something that we'll pick up again when we talk about fungi in a couple of weeks. But the roots, in addition to anchoring the plant, supporting its large size, in addition to finding water, they also provide a nice little house for fungi to live in. So keep that in mind. Store that little nugget of information somewhere safe. And we'll come back to it. All right. Once you get into vascular plants, the gametophyte is no longer the dominant phase. As far as I know, there is not a single vascular plant on Earth where the gametophyte is the dominant stage. Which means what's going to be the dominant stage? The sporophyte. Good. And sporophytes have 2 copies of the genome. And so the diploid sporophyte is the dominant stage in these vascular plants. And they have a structure that bryophytes typically don't have, and that's the leaf. And so they have a really complex structure that increases surface area and allows for just a lot of space for reproduction. Now, in a number of these vascular plants, sperm still have to swim from the male gametophyte, the antheridium, to the female gametophyte, the archegonium. And so a lot of these still vascular plants are still restricted to moist environments. All right, so you've got a vascular system. You have a way to transport water efficiently and well. You've got a root system to anchor these plants so they can get big because they can transport water. They can get big because they have a way to anchor themselves so they don't fall down. And then so we have a question. Here we're going to do our lecture break. I put it on the slide so that I don't have to keep repeating myself. And so here's the question. What is the relationship, if any, between diversity, the number of species, and complexity, how complex a structure is? For example, think of the bryophytes. They are non-vascular, so arguably they are less complex than vascular plants. Yes? Arguably. And so there are 260,000 species of vascular plants. There are nowhere near that many living bryophytes, non-vascular plants. Okay? So what is the relationship, if any, between diversity and complexity? And don't just say, as complexity increases, so does diversity, because that seems to be the case, but give some kind of an explanation for that. All right? Take a couple of minutes, go ahead and start immediately talking to those around you. You don't have to kind of sit and think and chew on it. And I'll let you know when it's time for us to discuss.
My thought oldest set is more diverse. The oldest set is much more.
Yeah,
Instead
things
of
need to
like-
fill certain niches as well and stuff like
Right.
that too. So as you create more niches as things, things need to fill those niches, and so you'll get more diversity.
And then when you have more generalists, that one species can take
Yeah.
take advantage of the niche. But let's say it changes, there's more diversified, and also there's more specialized. These species are specialized.
Yeah.
Those
You see that
individual
with
niches.
like finches as well. The finch isn't it's a generalized thing. It can move into any niche, but when it moves into that niche, it becomes more specialized to that niche.
So that explains diversity. More diversity because it's more generalist.
Yeah.
Now, there's nothing more complex. Well, you would say that it's generalist is a pretty simple beast. Let's say the fishes.
Yeah.
Because it needs a simple beast so it can take advantage of its adaptation.
Yeah.
If it has a more complexity, there's some fishes that have all of our processes.
Yeah.
That's a very specialized, somewhat complex beast.
Yeah.
But
So as you go, it needs a simple thing to work with.
so it's not necessarily a more complex organism, but it's kind of is because it's more special. But its specialization requires a more complex.
All right. We've got a question we have to deal with in order to be better equipped to deal with this question. And that question is, what do you mean by complexity? Right? There's a question that has to be addressed of what are we talking about when we're talking about complexity. And so, I think there are some really good ways of thinking through this. First of all, you have to understand that at the cellular level, everything is incredibly complex, right? So if you look at a moss and you look at, I don't know, like a coastal redwood, right? There's obviously going to be a huge difference in size. There's going to be a huge difference in complexity, arguably. But at the cellular level, both are incredibly complex, okay? And so when you're talking about complexity, it is not helpful to refer to complexity at the cellular level. It's just not helpful. And so when you're comparing eukaryotes to prokaryotes, don't fall into the temptation of saying eukaryotic cells are more complex than prokaryotic cells. Because do not talk about complexity at the cellular level. It's not helpful, okay? Everything is complex, okay? So you could say eukaryotes are more organized than prokaryotes. Absolutely they are. Does that mean they're more complex? It's not a question worth answering, okay? They are more organized, okay? You can compare them that way and see eukaryotic cells are more organized. Yes, they are. They've got a lot of places to kind of organize and store various materials, all right? So if you're going to address complexity and you're going to answer that question, what is complexity? We need to address it at the tissue and organ level, okay? But for plants, we've got to stop at the tissue level, okay? So for a plant, if you're going to say one plant is more complex than the other, you're talking about structures that are made up of cells. Different types of cells carrying out specific tasks to form a specific structure, okay? Are vascular plants more complex in that way than non-vascular? Absolutely. They have structures that do not exist in non-vascular plants, okay? And do non-vascular plants have structures that don't exist? Not really. They have different varieties of those structures. They don't really have structures that don't exist, all right? So we've dealt with that. Don't talk about complexity at the cellular level because you're going to get yourself into trouble and you're going to look silly. And I don't want you to look silly. Well, I don't actually mind all that much, but I don't want you to look silly with having a conversation about something that I taught you, right? Because then it comes back to me and then I look silly, and I don't like that, right? I don't like that at all, okay? So if you're going to talk about complexity, talk about it at the tissue level. Are vascular plants more complex at that level than non-vascular? Yes, they are. They have tissues and structures that don't exist in non-vascular plants. Now that we've got that sorted out, what is the relationship, if any, between diversity and complexity? Yeah.
So the non-vascular plants don't have as many components as the vascular plants. They don't have roots necessarily, and they don't really have the tracheas to move the water. So they're limited in their availability of like size and location. So whereas the vascular plants have that more options, I guess you would say, because they have more tissue variation in their tissues.
Okay. They do have more variation in their tissues, and you hit on two really, really important reasons why in that description. They are larger. If you are larger, you have more space to diversify structures, right? If your house is like 200 square feet, right? You're deep into that tiny house movement, right? And you want a house that you could like literally pick up and move with you, right? And so your house is tiny. Man, the complexity that you can pack into that is really limited. I mean, you could do some cool stuff, right? Any of you watch a documentary on tiny houses or seen some of that? And you could put some really cool stuff in a really small place. But you are certainly limited compared to if you have a 4,500 square foot house, right? You could just do a lot more, right? You can't put a bowling alley in a tiny house. You'd even have a hard time putting the little tiny bowling pins that children play with, right? And so the amount of complexity you can pack into a bigger structure is just more, right? You can pack more stuff, therefore there's more room to diversify, to build different structures. So that's a big thing. Vascular plants, they can grow larger than non-vascular plants, so that's part of the reason why they can have more complexity, and therefore you can get some more variety. And another aspect is they can be more isolated from water. Okay? They are better at storing and transporting water, so they can be a little bit more isolated from water. Meaning there are more environments that they can be part of and enter into. And you're like, well, mosses, they're cosmopolitan, right? They're located all around the world. Yeah, but restricted to specific environment types all around the world. Okay? Vascular plants just have a wider variety of places where they can live, and a wider variety of places comes with a wider variety of forms that you can take on, adopt. All right? Do you have something, Charles?
Yes. So when an organism is first, the basal organism, the one that everyone starts with, is generally more generalized.
Yes.
It's more generalized. Therefore, if you have this generalized species and this generalized species and this generalized species, they can adapt for different niches.
Yes.
And the diversity is not going to be as much. However, as this organism changes, it becomes more specialized.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden you have one general organism changing into 5 specialized organisms. And if that happens to across all the organisms, you're going to have more diversity.
Right, and I would buy that. So, but what you're talking about there is a difference between generalization and specialization and how that relates to diversity, right? You're not necessarily then getting into complexity because you got to attach that, right?
Well, I can, and that is as something becomes more specialized for an environment, it has to be more complex. For example, there's the crossbeaks, a bird.
Okay.
They have their upper and lower beaks cross each other like this.
Okay.
It's a very specialized adaptation for eating nuts and things like that. I would venture to say that their ancestor probably had a more simpler beak.
Okay.
For a more generalized diet, and then as it becomes specialized, it becomes more complex with the crossbeak.
And so I'm still there.
Okay.
I'm still there with the specialized versus generalized.
Right.
But I don't. You haven't sold me on how a beak like that is more complex than one that's less specialized. I would say yes, it's still more general, and it's certainly less specialized. Is that less complex? Is that less complex? I don't know. You have it. Yeah, Joseph.
So in other words, because I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
I think of it complex as the idea that it has more components. So
Sure.
if you have 2 Lego pieces, you can only get so complex.
Yes.
If you have 5 Lego pieces, you can get more complex. So a different shape of a beak isn't necessarily more complex, it's more diverse, but it doesn't necessarily have more components.
Right, and so that's why you'd have to, if you want to go with that, and that's fine. I see where you're going, right? But what you need to do is you need to be able to connect specialization with complexity. And so there are examples in which you can find that to be the case. It's not going to be the case here. You're going to have a hard time selling that the basal vascular plant, right, is more specialized than the basal non-vascular plant. You're going to have a hard time selling that, and yet the vascular plant's going to be far more complex, right? It's not any more specialized. In fact, you could even argue it's more generalized because the non-vascular plant is restricted to a specific environment type that has a lot of water present, right? Whereas the non-vascular or the vascular plant actually can use a wider range. So you could actually argue it's more generalized, and yet it's more complex.
Okay.
So complexity and specialization are not necessarily directly related, right? As something becomes more specialized, it doesn't necessarily become more complex. In fact, for most organisms, that act of specializing actually reduces complexity because you're limiting your ability to do other things. And this happens like with antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So a antibiotic resistant bacteria is more specialized because it is basically adapted for a very specific environment where that antibiotic is present, whereas the non-antibiotic resistant form is more generalized, right? It can use a wider variety of environments, and usually what leads to that antibiotic resistance is a loss of structure and a loss of the function, an actual loss of complexity. But again, then we'd have to talk about the cellular level, and we shouldn't talk about complexity at the cellular level. I did a horrible thing for you.
Right.
I'm sorry.
I can think of. I mean, I'm just.
Yeah, and you can think of examples. I'm not saying
Yeah,
that there are
yeah.
no examples where complexity and specialization don't go together.
Right.
Right? You're going to find examples where they do, but you're going to find examples where the opposite is true.
Okay.
And maybe just as many. Okay. And so I just want you to kind of get that specialization and complexity are not necessarily directly related. Where one increases, so does the other. All right, any other thoughts? Relationship between complexity and diversity.
Okay, so from the evolutionary perspective, you would have to assume that diversity gives rise to complexity. Isn't that like if we're here with an organism that is simple organism?
You would actually have to assume the former, that you would need some mechanism by which you could diversify.
Okay.
And the way in which you could, I mean, you're going to have examples of both, but you would need some way of increasing the complexity so that then you could diversify from there. And that would be the norm.
So in other words, an organism would have to become more complex so that it can then diversify.
Well, I mean, don't think of it as a specific organism, but a particular group,
Okay.
right? And so if you have a very simple form with very few structures, there's not a lot of opportunity for diversity, right?
Okay.
And that's why if you look at bryophytes, your non-vascular plants, liverworts, hornworts, mosses, there's not anywhere near the diversity that you find in vascular plants. And so the idea there is developing that vascular system allowed them to exploit other environments, allowed them to grow in size, which gave the ability to then diversify in form.
So in other words, you need a structure in a plant that you could specialize or change.
Yes.
And if there's not enough structures, then there's no way you could get from A to B.
Yes. Yeah. So like going back to your Lego illustration, if you've got two Legos, there's only so many different combinations you can make of those two Legos, right?
Yeah.
But if you've got 5 Legos, a lot more combinations that you can make of that. Yeah. Make sense? I know this is, I mean, this is like a philosophical yet scientific at the same time question. It's just weird. I get that. I'm a weird guy. I ask weird questions. I'd like to make people feel uncomfortable because it's funny to me when I sit here and I can tell like you're thinking about something, but thinking about that makes you a little uncomfortable, right? Because you don't know exactly what you should say, right? You don't even know exactly what you should think. You don't know, like, should you agree with Charles? Should you not agree with Charles? You know, so. Last framing question. Which are considered the most derived seedless vascular plants? And what I mean by the most derived is the least like the original vascular plant. So the one that is maybe most specialized in this case. This is where your idea would come in, Charles. The most specialized. Not necessarily the most complex, but the most specialized. All right, so tracheophytes, again, this group of all the vascular plants. They are seedless and still restricted mostly to moist environments. The seed is a wonderful structure we'll talk about in next week and really helps the embryo, which is the most fragile portion of the life cycle, from drying out. These are divided into two phyla. The Lycopodiophyta, which are your club mosses. And there are very few living species. However, in the Carboniferous, which I know you're like, I know exactly what you're talking about with that Carboniferous, right? It's right after the Devonian, right before the Permian. You're like, I got this. And so they dominate the Carboniferous, forming just huge forests that are now coal deposits. This is kind of cool. So regardless of what your view of origins is, you've got this huge group of organisms that now are present as coal deposits that we can access and use in particular ways. Hence, yeah, the name Carboniferous. Yeah, Sporophylls are leaves that contain the sporangia, the structures that make the spores. So again, keep in mind, this is a vascular plant, meaning which is the dominant stage, Gametophyte or Sporophyte? Sporophyte, right? Gametophyte is the dominant stage in non-vascular. Sporophyte, dominant stage in vascular plants. So this is, the whole thing's a sporophyte. On that sporophyte, there are leaves that contain sporangia. Sporangia make the spores, are the actual structure that makes the spores. Sporophyte are the organism that makes the spores. Sporangia are the structures that make the spores. Spores in all the names, right? All you got to remember is spore, and then write something sloppy at the end and hope for the best, right? Don't do that. People do that, and I know what you're doing, right? It's like everything is super neat. Some of you, it's funny. Like, some people have incredibly neat handwriting, way neater than mine. It almost looks like you printed it, and then all of a sudden there's one word in there, and it's messy. And you're oh man, they must have been rushing when they wrote that one word in the middle of this sentence where everything else is really neat. Oh, I know, they knew exactly what they were getting at. Don't just write spore and get messy. But spore is in all the names, so it does actually help. Oh yeah, so these sporophylls, these leaves that contain the sporangia are arranged in these bundles, and I'll show you what that looks like. We call those strobili, these bundles of leaves that contain the sporangia. And then the other phylum, Monolophyta, and this contains all of the rest of the vascular seedless plants, or seedless vascular plants, whatever you want to call it. Class Equicetopsida. This root equus, means horse. And so these are your horsetails. And so in horsetails, you have very little photosynthesis happening in the leaves. Most of the photosynthesis happens in the stem. Stem is very branched, has a lot of silica, so it feels really rough, almost like a glass like structure. They're really pretty plants, and really fantastic. They preserve really well because of that silicon. And so if you're like, you know what, I want to build a herbarium. I know that. That's a desire for all of us, right? You're like, I want to get a bunch of plants and catalog them, and I'm just going to have a herbarium in my house. I'm going to take it wherever I move. I'm going to keep it for the rest of my life. These are great plants for putting into a herbarium because they preserve really well. That's it. That's all I got about horsetails. So class Psilotopsida, which is actually includes all of the rest of the monolophytes. So you've got whisk ferns in here. These are extremely simple. They don't have roots, they don't have leaves, and they look like bryophytes. They don't have roots. Bryophytes don't have roots, right? Right? Bryophytes don't have roots. Mosses have rhizoids, which are like a hold-fast structure, but they're not roots, right? So they don't have roots. They don't have leaves. Bryophytes don't have leaves, and so they look like a bryophyte, but they're actually a tracheophyte. They're a vascular plant, and so they still have those tracheid cells. They still have a xylem, but they don't have roots. Very simple structures with sporangia at the tips.
Those supposed to say whisk ferns. It says witch ferns.
Yes, yes, it is. That's kind of fun. Which ferns?
Wish.
Which ones?
You happy? Sorry. I found another typo as I was going through this. I did not find that one, but I found a typo as I was going through it and I changed it, but yours on Canvas will still not be changed, and I don't remember where that typo was. I was going to point it out and I just blew right past it without noting it. So same class, Psilotopsida contains the rest of the ferns, and these are believed to be the most derived of all of your seedless vascular plants, your ferns. They are the least restricted to water. They are the most specialized. They're not necessarily the most complex, but they are certainly the most specialized and make up the overwhelming variety of these organisms. So these appear in the Devonian, which you're like, I know exactly where that is, right? Right after the Silurian, right before the Carboniferous, right? And so these have leaves, we call them fronds, and the reproductive structures, the sporangia, are on the bottom of the leaves. And so these are homosporous, meaning they make only a single type of spore. They don't make male spores and female spores, they make a single type. Heterosporous plants make two types. Okay. So which are considered the most derived seedless vascular plants? Ferns. Love it. What class? Psilotopsida. What phylum? Monolophyta. And then all in Tracheophyta. Okay. Now look at some of this variety. It's awesome. You'll love it. So here are the club mosses. Again, what is the dominant phase in a tracheophyte, in a vascular plant? Sporophyte. And so here we have the sporophytes of these plants. Here you have your sporangia, your structures that are going to make those spores. Here are your horsetails with their branched stems, and your sporophylls, these leaves that contain the sporangia. Here's these leaves, again, originate from these joints. The reason why the leaves don't do very much in the way of photosynthesis is because they are reproductive structures, right? They are sporophylls, arranged in bundles, okay? And so, most of the photosynthesis takes place in the really thick stem. Again, these preserve really well. So now when you all start your herbarium today, start with the horsetails. Although you're going to have to travel a ways to find some. Whisk fern, a very simple plant. In many ways looks like a bryophyte, lacks roots, lacks leaves altogether. At the very tip of these you have yellow knobs, the sporangia. And what's being produced in the sporangia? Spores. It's so good. I'm so proud of you. And I hope that continues into Friday. Because Friday, something different's going to happen. Something we haven't done before. Something that's a little bit less safe than our meeting so far. Because it's safe for you to say something here and to say something wrong, right? It's safe. But on Friday, it's not as safe, okay? So I want you to know, if between now and Friday you have questions about what you ought to put on your note card, you have questions about, does your note card look good? Ask me those questions, and I'll answer most of them. Some of them I may tell you I can't answer that, I'm sorry. But I'll answer most of those questions, all right, as you prepare. So here is a fern. And again, this is believed to be the most derived of all of your seedless vascular plants. And so here's the life cycle. You've got your sporophyte, the dominant phase of this plant. Here's your gametophyte. Look at the sporophytes growing right out of it. And eventually just grows so big it just completely obliterates the gametophyte. And so if you go in a place where there are a lot of ferns, a lot of times you can find these gametophytes on the soil before they get completely obliterated by the sporophyte. A sporophyte dominant stage, forming spores. Spores are formed on the bottom of these leaves in structures called sori. And so the sporangia are down there, these sori, They make a single type of spore. Here's your spores. Each spore can developing into a gametophyte. Gametophytes produce what? Gametes. And so they produce both male and female gametes. And then those gametes fuse to form the zygote, which will then develop into the sporophyte. Okay? Seedless, non-vascular plants. What's the dominant life stage? Non-vascular. Gametophyte. Seedless vascular plant. What about seed vascular plants? Sporophyte. From now on, other than your seedless, non-vascular plants, all plants have sporophytes as the dominant stage. So here's a zoom in picture of the sori, those sporangia growing, and what's being produced inside of those structures? Spores. And what are those spores going to develop into? Gametophytes. And what are those gametophytes going to make? Well, first they're going to make gametes. The zygote doesn't form until the male gamete and the female gamete fuse. That's what makes the zygote. And then what does the zygote develop into? Sporophyte. And the sporophyte is the dominant life stage of seedless vascular plants like ferns. So there's a type of fern called a bracken fern. It grows in a lot of forests around the U.S., and it actually has a natural mosquito repellent. And it's got 3 arms, and it's a really pretty plant. So if you're walking through the woods and you find a fern that looks like that, pop it off and put it on your head. Natural mosquito repellent. Plus, you look awesome. Awesome. And then lastly, here's a zoomed-in image of this gametophyte with the sporophyte growing right out of it, and will grow so large it just completely obliterates and actually resorbs part of that gametophyte. Gametophyte, very minor portion of the life history of a seedless vascular plant. All right? And I know it's a lot of terms, a lot of things to keep sorted. Take heart and be encouraged that this material is not on Friday's exam. However, it doesn't mean you could just kind of ignore it and put it to the side. Because you have to do your homework by the end of today. And I think only 4 people have done their homework so far. And it's due by the end of today. And last week, I think 4 or 5 people did not respond to someone's post. And that is the most horrible thing you can do, because it's very easy to just write, hey, I like the way you explained that, right? And then, but if you don't do that, I have to mark you down. And I don't like doing that, all right? Have a wonderful day. Be safe.
So, Dr. Engel.
Yes, sir.
With the